Let's move on to our next panel. Another big issue, of course, immigration and issues around employment for this election. Can I invite, please, our four panellists to the stage: Michael Woodhouse from the National Party, Andrew Little from Labour, Clayton Mitchell from New Zealand First, and Denise Roche from the Greens. Welcome to you all. So, a number of questions that we're going to be putting to these panellists. What will they do to ensure, for example, and this is something that has been going on for a long time, is our education system meeting the needs of business and our jobs market? Another, immigration policy, one of the big topics this year. How will that sit with each of these parties? Other scenarios as well. How would these parties encourage or even incentivise research and development? The 90-day trial periods, keep them or can them? What do you think? At the end of this panel, once again, we'll be opening up to the floor. Welcome your questions again. Please may I invite to the lectern Michael Woodhouse from National.
Thank you, Rachel. I'm still trying to get my head around the format for today, so I presume we're actually going through those answers simultaneously, so I have the podium unfettered. Well, good morning, everybody. What a great opportunity to dig into the well of policy that you're about to have landed on you. As the incumbent government, I guess we can look to the track record of the last 9 years, but I know that you are going to quickly dismiss that in favour of the sorts of things that you want us to talk about going forward. And we have a plethora of policies that are still rolling off the factory floor, so stand by. I think these are some of the most important issues facing business today, and they are challenges of confidence and growth. Confidence that we are creating hundreds of thousands of new jobs, and in the foreseeable future we're going to continue to be able to do that, but also in the sense that the economy is changing dramatically and quickly. So it is really important that our education system, both primary, secondary and tertiary, is producing the product that you require. Now, increasingly, the nature of work means that the way in which staff are engaging and the sorts of skills that you need them to do or to have in order to be able to adapt that quickly is also changing. And so what you need is an employment relations environment that's fair, flexible and safe. And that's what we will produce. That's what we have created, I think. But there's no doubt that there are certainly challenges of both the volume, the number of people in the workforce that are available to do jobs, and of course the quality of that. Now, we have invested very heavily in the sorts of industries that you have identified through your surveys are in short supply. They're in construction, they're in technology, they're in IT and they're in hospitality. And we have certainly significantly increased the funds available for apprenticeship training. I think last year it was 5,000 new positions for apprenticeship training in those areas. In budget 2017, funding for another 2,000 apprentices on top of what we had already done. In technology, the establishment of 3 IT grad schools is going to, I think, be significant in ensuring that that pipeline of IT skills that we so desperately need, particularly in cities like this one, will continue. In fact, just the other day, I think the South Island grad school was formally launched, Signal it's called. That's a collaboration of 7 separate universities and colleges in the South. So there's an awful lot going on. I think what we do need to do is make sure that career counselling in schools is better targeted to our needs. It does worry me that I go to schools and see lots of posters for University of Otago and Auckland and Massey and so on. Very little in the way of trade training, hospitality, primary industries, which are so important to our economy. And of course, while we continue to have skills and labour in short supply, we are going to need immigration policies that support you and don't work against you. And the National Party is the only party in Parliament that is not pledging to arbitrarily reduce migration. Every single one of the parties represented on this podium will do that. How they will do that, which of your industries they will decimate by doing that, is a little light on detail. But we will not allow your growth to be impeded by a lack of labour. Now, there's a quid pro quo to that, and you know I, as Immigration Minister, have asked the industries that do rely heavily on overseas labour to tell a better story about the work that they're doing, sometimes with government, to ensure that that domestic pipeline of labour is available to you. And we will support you through that. And Tolly and I work extremely hard with Paul Goldsmith to make sure that's the case. But there's no doubt that right now and for the foreseeable future, we will need to continue to rely on overseas workers to continue our growing economy. But be very clear, the economy is not growing because of those overseas workers. Demand for labour is growing because the economy is growing and your businesses are doing so well. And we will meet that demand with you with a mix of both domestic and overseas solutions. Now, research and development is going to continue to be a hot topic, and I'm a chartered accountant by trade. The tax accountants in the room are probably tempted to vote Labour. But I can tell you that an R&D tax credit, as you know, is the laziest and least focused policy you can have for research and development. My government would much prefer to be able to work with you to ensure that the continued strengthening of an innovation ecosystem that starts with targeted grants for good ideas. And we've got a number of pipelines through which we can do that. Callaghan, Marsden, the Centres of Research Excellence, plenty of other opportunities for you to benefit from the support of government. But bear in mind, government and innovation are two words that shouldn't often be put into the same sentence. You guys are the experts. You guys know where the economy is going. You know where innovation is heading. Our role is to support you with an appropriate infrastructure, including a broadband infrastructure that means that tyranny of distance disappears. And I live in a city that has gig speed now, and their biotech and IT out of Dunedin is becoming much, much more prominent because of it. So we will continue to support you both through the Centres of Research Excellence, the science grants, the Callaghan funding and the Marsden funding that we have bumped up quite so significantly. Fair and flexible employment practices is what I was talking about, and a 90-day trial period is very much part of that. We have no intention to abolish it. I think it works well. The horror stories that were predicted did not come. The overwhelming number of our employers in this country are fair, are reasonable, do want to give people a go, but the 90-day trial period, in my view, has worked and it saved jobs through the recession. Do I support wage bargaining within individual companies and across sectors with national awards? Well, that's over to you. But we have an Employment Relations Act that provides for all of those arrangements if you wish. Multi-employer collective agreements are prominent mostly in the health sector, but they are certainly possible. I don't think we need to legislate to require them. That would be retrograde. Some of you, are, like me, are old enough to remember the 60s and 70s. I don't think that's a place we want to go. Thank you. I'll leave it there. I think that was a bell. So, yes, I should shut up. Look forward to your questions. Cheers.
Thank you very much, Immigration Minister Michael Woodhouse. Andrew Little now from the Labour Party.
Thank you, Rachel, and good morning, everybody. Thank you to Business New Zealand for hosting today's event. I want to rapidly get through certainly the first three questions because I think the last two are interesting. The questions are loaded, they're pretty dumb questions, and I'll get to that very shortly. I have a message for Business New Zealand, which is you're either part of the problem in this world or you're part of the solution, and I want Business New Zealand to be part of the solution. Can I just say very quickly, this is all about human capital, skills and employment. The Labour Party spent 2 years doing a piece of work called the Future of Work. Here is our report on it, and it is about understanding the impact of automation, globalisation and the trend towards greater collaboration between businesses and between individuals. What the report concluded was that there are nearly 1 million jobs in New Zealand today at risk because of automation and technological change over the next 20 years. So we've got to understand this stuff, start making decisions and policies now that are going to make sure that we have a country which in 20 years' time, anybody who wants to work, who can work, is able to work, to earn, to stand on their own 2 feet. That's a very important Labor principle. We have to get the settings right, because if we don't, we will get worsening inequality, and that's something that we're not prepared to tolerate. One of the things that the report concluded was that what we need to make sure is that we are producing young people entering the workforce with a sense of inclusiveness, resilience and adaptability, because the world of work they're going into is going to be radically different. How they do their work, what work they do, the level of entrepreneurialism in their work is going to be significantly different to what most of us in this room would be used to. So we're across this. We have a vision for it. We've done the spade work on it, and we need to make sure that we're making good laws and good policy decisions about it. Let me rapidly go through these questions about the education system, producing more skills needed by business. One other little message to the business community: it's not all about you. What you will see from Labor is a commitment to an education system to produce young adults with a range of intellectual, practical and social skills for the future of this country, including business, because they will have a range of different experiences throughout their working and adult life, some of which will be in work, some will be creating their own work, some of which will be in periods of no work at all. Labor's focus is on the quality of teaching. We know that the single biggest determinant for success in education is the quality of the teacher in front of the student. So we're going to make a real effort on teacher training, professional development for teachers, supporting teachers with the skills and the means in the classroom to do the job that we expect them to do. We plan to ensure that all students will have access to mobile digital devices. We will have a school leavers toolkit, including learning to drive at school, but also key workplace competencies, financial literacy and those other things. One of the things we will make a priority of is professionalising the careers advice in schools. Dedicated professionals who will work with the students, their parents, the teachers, local businesses and industry, as well as the myriad of training providers that you have, polytechs, universities, ITOs and those employers offering apprenticeships, to make sure that good decisions and good choices are made by young people and their parents compared to what we've got at the moment. And finally, we have a commitment to 3 years free post-school education and training, as well as subsidising employers to take on apprentices, re-establishing night classes for adults. On immigration policy, we have a problem at the moment. We have a level of immigration, inward immigration at the moment, that is causing major problems to some of our biggest cities, especially Auckland, but also increasingly Hamilton and Tauranga. We can cut immigration. We don't need up to 20,000 international students doing very low quality courses and with the right to work that goes with that, and actually entering or ending up in situations of exploitation. And so we will better manage immigration, we will better and more tightly manage the labour market test, but where there are genuine skill shortages, including regional skill shortages, which is part of our policy, then employers will be able to recruit offshore. We do not see immigration as a source of cheap labour. On encouraging research and development, as I get around and talk to businesses, they tell me two things. Some businesses quite like the grant-based scheme that Callaghan Innovation offers. Others would prefer research and development tax credits. There is a lot of wasted effort and money goes into applying for a grant to Callaghan, and if you're not a big business that can absorb that, then you just don't do it. Research and development tax credits do meet the needs of a sector of the business community, and we will reintroduce one. In terms of the 90-day trial periods, I noticed you talk about abolish, keep or extending. Actually, we're going to make the trial periods fairer. Labor has always accepted, because it's always been our law, that employers can take somebody on a trial or probationary period. That will continue, but we'll reinstate the fairness requirements that we used to have. Every small business owner I've spoken to in the last 3 years, and we have this discussion about it, I say, what do you think about the idea of requiring employers taking somebody on a trial period, giving them feedback during that trial period? Every single one of them says, but I do that already. So when I say, so if we write into the law that you're required to do that, what would you think? Well, it's not a hassle for me, they say, because I do it already. So you know what? We're going to write that into the law, because good employers are doing that already. And the other thing we're going to do is deal with what happens at termination. It is not right that something as important as your employment, your source of livelihood, should end if you consider it ending unfairly and you have no recourse. So we will introduce a very quick, efficient, fair means of dealing with any grievance that arises out of it. It'll be a no lawyers, referee-based, very quick and dirty sort of system with a cap on any remedies. I just want to point out the Business New Zealand analysis on our policy said this: removal of incentives to hire inexperienced or untested young and other workers will promote increased unemployment for young and unskilled workers. Memo to Business New Zealand. Read the Motu research report that Treasury commissioned on the 90-day trial period, because that told us that it hasn't created a single extra job and it hasn't provided extra opportunities for young and inexperienced workers. Why do we have 70,000 young people not in work, education or training at the moment if the 90-day law was going to create all these jobs? It doesn't do it. Finally, on wage bargaining, because there's an interesting question about supporting wage bargaining with individual companies. Let me very quickly tell you the story of the Wellington bus drivers. The regional council contract for the buses went up for tender. The existing bus company tendered. Another bus company with 7 buses and fewer drivers tendered for it and won it. They tendered for it on the basis of a much lower payroll cost. The bus drivers had absolutely no say in that. And they are now being asked to sign up to employment agreements that will mean that they will have lower incomes as a result. They're doing the same job, same skills, same responsibilities. They didn't have a look-in. There is something wrong with our labour market and our wage setting when last year 2/3 of wage and salary earners got pay increases that were less than the cost of living. There is something wrong with our wage system when 40% of children living in households below the poverty line have working parents, either mum or dad both working. There is something wrong when in the last 10 years we've seen a proliferation of charities set up to provide meals for kids in schools. We have far too many workers in New Zealand on wages that are too low, and we have to fix that. And I go back to the point I made at the very beginning. We do have a low wage problem in New Zealand, and I would like to know that the next Labour government can engage constructively and meaningfully with Business New Zealand and the business community on how we change that. Not just about lifting productivity, of course that's vital to it, but we have to lift wages. And I just repeat that point. For Business New Zealand, either you're part of the problem and you stand on the sidelines whinging and moaning about solutions that other people are coming up with, or you're part of the solution. And I just invite you, get with the program. Thank you.
Andrew Little, thank you. Questions from the floor shortly. Clayton Mitchell now, please, from New Zealand First.
Thank you, Rachel. A big thank you to Business New Zealand, Catherine, Kirk, and everybody here today, Deloitte for sponsoring this great event, and all the people that have come along. I know it's a very important afternoon, and I would like to suggest that we don't just make this 1 month before an election get-together, because I think these sorts of meetings are important mid-term as well, keeping government, whoever that might be, honest and upfront with their policies and how they're tracking with what they're saying today. And I think we hear a lot of promises thrown out there, like bread and butter at a fish and chip shop just before an election, getting everybody excited, and then we don't get any follow-through. So it is great for me to be speaking about employment here today. And business is the lifeblood of our economy. When I look at water, and we talk about water here today, that is certainly the lifeblood of our environment. Without business, we have got no economy. Whether it be the small and medium-sized businesses, which are driving 97% of what actually happens right in front of us here today, employing most of our people, we've got to make sure that we have a balance between looking after the needs of our employers and the needs of our employees, and they have a relationship that comes together that works in a balanced, harmonious situation where they're actually both getting something out of it. What we've got here at the moment is a situation where we've had neoliberalism, which is a trickle-down ideology which has been failing us. We need to start looking at building our economy from the bottom up, working with business and working with employees together. And when I've travelled around the country talking to many businesses, and I've been a businessman myself for 25 years, and I asked this question to these business people, I said, if you could pay your staff more and you weren't going to inflate the economy and you weren't going to affect your profitability, would you do that? And emphatically, 100% of every person that I've ever asked that question here today, and if I could ask you to put your hand up, you'd probably do that, the answer is yes. Absolutely. Going back to it, providing my profitability of my business for many, which is just a means to an end for some people, or making sure that we weren't going to inflate the price of bread and milk and cheese and the cost of living, and I was going to be able to pay my staff more? Absolutely I would, they say. And that's why New Zealand First has come out with a policy to increase the minimum wage to $20 per hour over the next 3 years. But before I hear you all gasp and freak on that, but it is with a tax package for businesses to make sure that the fiscal neutrality maintains. There will be no incursion of extra costs on your business to employ your staff more. We must look at building the economy from the bottom up so there is more money to go around. And when we look at the degradation around this country at the moment after the last 9 years, I shudder and look to see that something needs to be done seriously. And listening to the comments of Michael Woodhouse saying that this party is the only party that's not looking at immigration as being a problem, that GDP is on the rise under this government, I think you only have to scratch the surface to see that GDP per capita is absolutely at the bottom of the OECD. With more people coming in, 73,000 net immigrants a year, some of them with skills, absolutely, granted that. Some of them with things that are going to help grow our economy, I grant you that. But many of these people we're letting in don't have skills, don't have qualifications, don't have the education that are going to actually fundamentally drive our economy. We do have an RSC scheme here looking after the low skilled sector, particularly around kiwifruit workers and the likes. Now, we're not talking about getting rid of them either. We understand that business needs immigration. New Zealand First has never said we want to stop immigration. We just want a policy that is going to control it. We understand that people want to come to this great country and build our economy and help out. But it's making sure that they've got the skills that we need, not the people that need us. That's got to be the focus. We will absolutely not restrict business by putting in incursions on immigration, but we will make sure that the people come here do add that value. Just now heading to the questions, how will you ensure the education system produces more skills needed by business? Over this government's term, we have seen hundreds of millions of dollars be taken away from trade training programs and apprenticeships. And when we talk to these people out there trying to promote their business, get these people upskilled and educated, there's no funding or support that was there 9, 10, 12 years ago. So we will make sure that we've got vocational pathways, make sure that we understand the needs of our future. When we talk to the trucking industry, they don't have apprenticeships for truck drivers. It doesn't exist. We will make sure that those skills are available under apprenticeship programs funded by the government to make sure that we've got a workforce that can grow. We've got an upfront education policy that will ensure that our New Zealanders don't become the brain drain. They get educated, they get qualified, and then where do they go to pay off their student loan? To Europe, to Japan, to Asia, to America. We want to keep those people here, so we will replace a skill debt for the cost of time back to your country. So we can actually get the skills staying here, working for New Zealand, building our economy, as opposed to using immigration as an excuse not to train our very own people. Second point, will your immigration policy let business employ staff from overseas where needed? I think I've answered that. Absolutely we will. And although we've said we see an immigration of around 10,000 net, we're not going to be doing that overnight. We will be making sure that we have good discussions with business sectors. We have had many of those already. We understand the needs and the complexity of making sure that we just don't cut it off overnight and then we've got people that can't do the jobs. But we must work towards getting people that we need that are going to grow our economy and not just open up the floodgates of 73,000 people a year. What is your preferred approach for encouraging research and development? Well, there's a two approach to this. We have got incentives with tax packages to make sure that those businesses that may not qualify for grants, that they can actually get some incentive for those research and development to grow. We are a trading nation. We are very pro-trade. But to be pro-trade, we have to look at opportunities that we can invest in to get better research, to make sure that we've got the right infrastructure in place to drive our economy offshore. But it's about added value exports. We can't keep doing what we've always done expecting we're going to get a different outcome. So we're looking at investment into those added value export opportunities, and that will come through a two-pronged attack, as I've said. Will you abolish, keep or extend the 90-day trial? Look, being in business for 25 years, when this was introduced, I thought it was a good idea. And when I look around the room here at the sort of businesses some of you have actually spoken with, I see responsible capitalists. Right? We're not talking about multinational organisations here that are just looking after the bottom line. We are talking about people that look after and understand the value of the people that you employ. But the 90-day work trial does give businesses some sense of security and insurance when you're starting to take on employees. And finally, do you support wage bargaining with individual companies or across sectors with national awards? I think there's a two-prong attack on this. When you're talking about wage bargaining, I think it comes down to an individual company's ideology. But when you talk about pay equity, and the reason why New Zealand First wouldn't support the pay equity ideology was because they were only narrowly looking at it within an industry. And if you're talking about pay equity, and it is genderised towards women and the pay equity there, but it also is genderised towards men. And if you take that neutrality out, if you take the neutrality and look at gender as general, men and women, doesn't matter what industry you're in, if you're not getting paid fairly, then you must look across all sectors to get an outcome. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Clayton Mitchell from New Zealand First. Our final panellist we will hear from now before we open the floor for questions, Denise Roche from the Greens.
Tēnā koutou katoa. Firstly, thank you to Business New Zealand for the opportunity to speak to you today. Going through the questions, I'll start at the beginning. How would we ensure that the education system produces more skills needed by business? I guess what we've seen over the last 9 years is access to higher education has been increasingly difficult. And if we are to create the type of economy which fosters innovation and fixes some of the problems that we're dealing with today, then certainly we should be looking at higher education being easier to access. So we would launch a national campaign promoting the benefits of a career in science, maths, technology and engineering. We'd re-establish the ability to access student allowances for postgraduate students. We'd establish new government funds for PhD scholarships in the priority areas of engineering, maths, computer and physical sciences for research and development capability building. And we would create specific educational incentives to remove barriers for groups who are currently underrepresented to study engineering, mathematics, computer and physical sciences, because we absolutely waste the potential of our young people if we can't get them through to where they can contribute the most. Definitely there needs to be workforce planning with the business sector. We've seen over the last few years that there is a real shortage in the building sector, for example. I heard recently it was about 65,000 workers are needed for the current building program. And yet we have not been encouraging or doing enough to encourage the trades for our young people, and we really should be addressing that. And that means that we also need to be looking at the careers development on offer at schools so that we can start to build those vocational pathways. In terms of research and development, you would have heard earlier from James Shaw about our Green Infrastructure Fund that does actually include some incentives around research and development. It's kind of really sad to know that while this government has actually improved the amount of investment they're putting into research and development, we are still lagging way behind other countries of a similar size in the OECD. We will help to basically, we want to see more investment from the government. We would match I think it's Labor policy actually, about $500 million in tax credits for R&D funding. But actually, for firms that go into overseas ownership, we would actually require that those innovation grants be paid back. And for large grants, where companies that receive significant taxpayer funds, it might be sensible for the government to take a stake in the business. In terms of immigration policy, yes, we actually think it's okay and it's a good idea for businesses to be able to attract overseas workers for their particularly skilled, high-skilled jobs. And we've been somewhat concerned by the changes, the tweaks to the policy settings for immigration recently, which has meant that it's more difficult for families to settle here, and it's certainly more difficult for people to stay here once they've made a commitment to come and work here. And so what we'd like to see is some adjustment to that. But we actually believe in the current system, which is those skilled jobs, we should be advertising them first, particularly when we've got about 90,000 young people out of work currently. The other area about overseas workforces is the recognised seasonal employers and the seasonal work, which I think Clayton touched on. We can see the benefit of this, but actually we do get a bit concerned that this can be used to exploit workers. And I've seen many examples of this, piece rates being paid to workers in some of the agricultural sectors. We don't want to see immigration used as a way of keeping wages down, and I'm continually hearing stories of people on temporary work visas who are essentially being exploited, which means we need to amp up the amount of factory inspectors labour inspectors that we have in this country, so that we can actually keep an eye on employers. I favour personally the Canadian model, which is which means that there's a lot more scrutiny of employers when they are accessing labour from overseas. In the area of 90-day trials, actually we'd abolish it entirely. Andrew referred to the Motu research, which was done for Treasury, which showed that actually it hadn't created any jobs. What it has done is demoralise young people who are going into the workforce, and anybody who's going into the workforce actually, that threat of dismissal. We are generally a country that prides itself on being fair, and we have a whole system of natural justice when it comes to employment and employment law, which should be applied from day one. If we can't apply it, if businesses can't apply it, then actually maybe you need to look at the way you're doing business, because it's not reasonable to expect people to be sacked without any genuine reason, whether that's on day 10 or day 110. We do support industry-based bargaining, and one of the things that we have in our policy talks about increasing the ability for employers to come in under multi-employer collective agreements, which essentially would in effect create industry standards. We know for a fact that multi-employer and employer collective agreements at the moment do tend to set industry standards anyway in a competitive workforce. And we see the absolute worth in actually creating some minimum standards across industries, which means that competition then happens in a different arena, not in the area of forcing wages down. We have to realise, I think, that wages are not keeping up with the cost of living, and that point's been made earlier. They're not keeping up with the cost of living. We have more and more and more workers relying on family tax credits, but essentially this is actually a top-up of wages that are too low. So we need to be looking at ways to ensure that people earn enough to live on. Thank you.
Thank you, Denise. Well, two of our big topics this year for the election, education and immigration. I think you've got microphones there next to you, one or two. We will take some questions from the floor now. We've got our roaming microphones, I think. Got a question over here. Thank you.
Thanks. Hi, Paul Mackay from Business New Zealand. I just want to go back to this morning when Grant Robertson talked about shared prosperity. And I have to say that as a strapline, I think that resonates with most of us. Prosperity, though, to the average punter in the street probably equates to the money in their pocket. And so the question becomes one of how are we going to grow the share of the money in everybody's pockets? And the other thing about shared prosperity is that it can be interpreted in different ways. It can be wealth distribution, the wealthy having earned it, giving it to those that didn't, or at the other end it's about everybody growing their contribution, their value. So a question for everybody on the panel, and I guess Clayton Mitchell has partly answered this. There's overseas research, quite a bit of it, not just one report, that says that if you just lift wages, particularly at the bottom, unemployment is the usual result, and the biggest sufferers are the inexperienced and the youth and the like. So the questions are, if growth in wages is a goal for us all, how will you do it in a sustainable way? How will we keep the young people, particularly those young people who would otherwise suffer, in jobs?
I think Andrew Little was the answer to that first.
We'll start over here then. Thanks, Paul. I was assuming that you wrote the Business New Zealand analysis on Labour's policy, which is why I find it so problematic. Here's the thing. The status quo is we have 2/3 of wage and salary earners last year couldn't get pay increases that actually kept pace with the cost of living. And we have massive unemployment of young people, the 16 to 24-year-olds. So the status quo isn't working, comrade. I'm sorry, it's not working. So we have to do something differently. I suppose the second point I'd make is this conversation is segmented, obviously. We've already had the discussion about the economy, discussion about resources. Now we're talking about employment. When we're talking about lifting wages, it is in the context of a growing economy, a sustainably growing economy as well. So we have a set of economic policies and strategies that's about growing the economy. We have to do that stuff. And we are very much focused on the high value, high margin, high export value led stuff. But we cannot be in a situation as we have at the moment where we have 3 to 3.5% growth, exceeding many other countries, but we have the low wage problem and the poverty problems that we've got now. Something is out of whack and we've got to change it, and there's the magic formula there somewhere. We've put up our idea about industry agreements. We want to talk to business about the rules around that, but we have to have a conversation about how we better share the gains of a growing economy, because the equation's not right at the moment.
Denise.
I agree with what Andrew's just said. Essentially, as productivity increases, then the share that goes to labour should actually increase as well. That's how it's always worked in the past, except over the last, since the last couple of the last 10 years or so, there's been a huge decrease in the amount of money that's going to workers. So we need to actually look at ways that we can do that better. What I was about to say before the bell rang before is that one of the things that does worry me is that the transfers from government to lower paid households is actually keeping wages effectively low. It's become a way that bolsters really low wages, which means that employers are getting off the hook. And frankly, it's not good enough. We need to share that wealth better.
Yeah, look, great question, and I don't entirely agree. And I think there's also research that says when you increase the minimum wage, it actually increases cash flow throughout your country. And when you can actually build your economy from the bottom up, everybody is better off. And particularly if you're not going to go and hyperinflate, to use that term, I know it's not quite right, your economy. But when you talk about a globalisation model and you talk about how the multinationals are going to benefit from a low-wage economy, and the people that have got the skills, the people that have got the education and the training that are going offshore to get better wages, then it fundamentally undermines the comments that you've just made. What we're trying to do is talk about pay parity with Australia, which we talked about at the last election. We haven't seen that. We've seen 50 cents per annum pay rises over the last 3 years, and that's not keeping up with the inflation rates of the cost of living. What we're talking about is making sure that we get a good jump and increase in wages. It's not going to affect your profitability of your business. It's going to ensure that there's more money to go around. We're also going to take GST off food, which will bring the cost of living down. People should not be taxed to live in this country, just to eat and get by. And the next question I'm sure you're going to say is, how are you going to pay for it? And we've got an answer for that as well.
Okay, so you guys live in the real world, don't you? Okay? So, I could be facetious and say, why stop at 20, let's go to 25 or 30, because if there are no impacts to increasing the minimum wage by 25% straight away, why wouldn't we do it? And actually, I'm quite proud of the minimum wage that we have, which is relative to our average wage, is the highest in the OECD, and I think in real terms it's about the second or third highest. But the best way to increase the amount of money in people's pockets is to stop taking out of their pockets in the first place. And so this party is the one that is committed to a lower tax, lower spending government as we can afford it. Now, the other thing that we haven't heard about today is universality. And one of the things Labor talks about is a universal basic income coming forward. We are committed to targeting to those families and individuals in most need, which was why Budget 2017 had such a huge focus on family incomes through working for families, income-related rents, and accommodation supplements, because that's where the need is. And of course, the productivity question that Paul asks is very much wedded to the question of science and innovation and work methods and investing in capital equipment and technology. That means that for every hour of input, we get a greater level of output. That's the simple metric of productivity. We don't do that by arbitrarily raising wages. We do that by rewarding greater skills and productivity in our workplace.
Use your microphone, Andrew, if you need to chirp in. Feel free.
Hi, Andrew Pyro from Spark here. Look, I'll start with a quick comment. It's from the election survey that BusinessNZ has done here, whichever page it is. One of the questions which intrigued me, the answer, over the next 5 to 10 years, do you believe there will be significant impacts on the size and composition of your workforce as a result of emerging technology, such as artificial intelligence, robotics, etc.? And I was quite frankly astounded to see that 51% of the members of Business New Zealand said no to that question. So I'm not quite sure what my friends around the room were smoking when they answered that question. But I think there's a major challenge that we've got here as a country, and to Labor's credit, I mean, Labor has tried to address this issue with the Future of Work study. But I think a lot of the conversation that there is around this issue is focusing on young people and getting them and making sure they have the skills when they come into the workforce. But what about retraining of existing workforces?
Yeah, that's why we've made the commitment about 3 years free post-school educational training. We use that language specifically. It's not just about young folks leaving school and going and doing a degree or a polytech course. It's actually throughout your working life. If you don't do something straight away when you leave school, you know you've got access to the means to get education and retraining throughout. It's also why we are committed to reintroducing adult learning in the evening, reintroducing evening classes, because they are often a first step to getting other qualifications. The reality is, it's not just a thing of the future, it's actually right now. People changing jobs, changing industries, changing careers, and we need to make sure that people have the means to get the education and the skills to do that throughout their working life. We're totally committed to it.
Minister, I've got... Oh, sorry, carry on, Denise.
Well, I'd just sort of add to that as we move to a carbon neutral economy as well, we need to be looking at how we ensure that workforces change. And so we need to be developing that whole just transition sort of process, which includes income support while people retrain.
Okay. Minister, I've got a question for you. You said when you addressed the crowd before that you were worried that some areas of our education system wasn't meeting our jobs market and that some areas weren't catered for, in particular in hospitality and tourism. So my question would be, what are you doing about that? And I recently spoke to, I think it was either the Master Builders or the Tradesmen's Association, and they said they've got people who want to become tradesmen. What they don't have is the people to train them. They don't have enough training establishments. So what are you doing to meet that need as well?
Yeah, look, I think the negative aspect of the comment I made was really in relation to career counselling and actually building an interest in some of those occupations that have in recent years not been particularly promoted. And I think industry has a role to play in working with our education system in attracting people into those sorts of trade trainings. And there is, I think, you've touched on an area where, frankly, in previous governments that did underinvest in trade training have left a bit of a gap in the teaching cohort But I'm not...
And saying that, Christchurch, for example, the earthquakes happened a long time ago. We knew that there would be a great need for tradesmen then. So, we have...
I think Christchurch is an example of where we have really beefed up both the number of people in training and the number of people training them. But remember, industry training is just that. It's a mixture of on-the-job, in-classroom and textbook training. And so it requires a collaborative effort. It's not, and I think that's the problem, that we see training as some kind of purely academic, classroom-based thing. And one of the things that I do agree with Andrew and the Labour Party in the work that they've done in identifying the future of work, but the manner of which we train our accountants, our surveyors, our pilots, has to come a little bit out of the classroom and more closely engage with industry on that. So it's a dual task, I think.
Okay, I think I've got another question. I've got a couple of questions over here.
Rachel, can I just, I didn't get to answer that, so I might as well just
Jump
tuck
on
in
in.
while you're running around there with your running shoes on. Look, I'm not surprised at the outcome of that report, actually at 51% of Business New Zealand. In fact, I would suggest I was expecting it to be a little bit higher. And the reason why I say that is because that question is an age-old question that has been plaguing us for since the start of the Industrial Revolution about what jobs are going to be replaced by robotics and so forth. And so we are in a emerging market and we don't fully understand where this market might end up, where it's going or how we're going to get there. But we do know where we're going to be in 2 years and we're starting to get an idea where we're going to be in 5 years. And so the job market is going to change and the labour force needs to change with it and be prepared for those changes. And New Zealand First absolutely accepts that. And it's understanding the direction that we're going in and the vocational pathways that people can segue from being a taxi driver after we go to fully automated taxis into another industry that is going to be made available to them.
Okay, question here, please.
It's a question maybe for the Minister and for Mr Little. Firstly, a comment. There's a lot of talk and a lot of sensationalism around the changing workforce, and in 10 years' time, 1 million jobs won't exist. But there's very little attention given to the fact that the working week is changing. And I think in 2015 in the US, the survey said that something like 25% of the workforce was in contingent or other type of work, whether temp contract, statement of work. And yet it strikes me at the moment that the current legislation is really geared towards the 40-hour week. And I think that MB themselves are not compliant with the appropriate holiday pays and the like, and lots of us are caught up in issues around calculation of holiday pay. And yet today we're talking about, I think there's an assumption made that the 90-day trial period gives us some sort of flexibility. And yet in an environment where probably the average tenure is 2 years and falling, and in 10 years' time we'll have people for 6 months, 3 months, 2 hours, 10 hours, which we need with this ageing population. And yet there's no talk, as I can see from either National or Labour, as to how they're going to deal with this ever-increasing contingent population.
Right. I'll start, if you don't mind, Andrew. I think, so firstly, let me just talk about the million jobs. In slightly disagreeing with Andrew, I'm not critical of the stat, but I think what we're more likely to see is jobs changing quite dramatically. So as a chartered accountant, when MYOB and QuickBooks came in and I was teaching small businesses how to account for their own transactions, that was going to be the end of business services accountants. And in fact, quite the opposite occurred. Instead of getting a shoebox full of checkbooks and bank statements, we got a USB stick, and then we were able to add value in a different way. And we're continuing to evolve that. Even in law, it's not hard to find out what the law says about something, just Google it. And yet getting really good advice lifts lawyers' games. I think we're going to see that across the whole economy. And so those million jobs aren't going to disappear and be replaced by something else. They're just going to morph as they have. I think we are on the edge with things like 3D printing and the ubiquitous nature of the Internet of Things, that we are going to see that change. And you're absolutely right. Employment law, income tax law, Holidays Act, and so on, which I am on record as saying I think is poorly crafted, does need to be constantly amended. And we've already done that actually through, for example, the 0 hours changes that we made last year, making sure that when people make choices about how they want to engage with the workforce, they're firstly compliant, like they pay their tax, right? So we need a tax framework that's nimble enough to do that, and that's what transformation is doing. but also that they're protected against exploitation, which is part of the changes that we made. I think that's the first chapter of a raft of reforms that we're going to continue to need to do to make sure our legislative framework doesn't impede that innovation in our workforce.
Michael is right that when we talk about the figure is 885,000 jobs, I think, in New Zealand today, radically different in the future. And Michael is right, it's not the jobs will necessarily go, the content will change dramatically. But in order to do the content of the new jobs, you need added skills and training, and that's, I think, so the jobs become higher value jobs. That's a good thing, and we need to encourage that. On the point that you make, I mean, one of the things we make in our points we make in our report is it's not just work, it's the way we work and the structure of the working week and the ability for technology to allow us to change all that. It still leaves open the question about how do we make sure that people aren't exploited or treated unfairly, and having a legal framework that meets that new modern need. I think that is the challenge. I think Michael has identified that as well. I do just want to put on record, for the sake of historical accuracy, that the last piece of great tripartitism before the aged care and home worker deal that this government did was actually the current Holidays Act. The Holidays Act, as we know it, and all the amendments since, have only ever happened with the agreement of Business New Zealand, the Council of Trade Unions, and the government, the Minister of the day. So if you've got complaints about it, take it up with Kirk. He'll know all about it.
We've got some more questions from the floor. I think I did have one over here, didn't I? Did you have another question, sir? No? No. Do you have one more question? No? Have you got any more questions from the floor? Sorry, apologies. Hi, Kim. How are you?
Thank you, Rachel. Kim Campbell here. Perhaps it's for Andrew. This new industrial relations framework, the fairer workplaces, it kind of looks like code for what we had in the 70s, to me. You know, and I'm really old, and I remember the Mangere Bridge, and you may also remember the BNZ Tower. And national awards, collective agreements kind of make me a bit nervous. So can you sort of cast our minds forward a little bit? You're in government now and you're putting this in place. Are we going to see, you know, strikes in sympathy and the rubbish not collected and the trains not running? Give me some comfort that it isn't going to turn the clock back to the 70s.
All right, Kim, I'm happy to give you comfort. Here's the thing. Unionism in New Zealand is voluntary. We are committed to voluntary unionism. And no one is suggesting changing that. So radically different to what it was in the past. Can I just say this about the 1970s and perhaps the 1960s, is that was an age when you could go, work, earn enough to buy a home, raise a family, and have a decent life. And that is the ambition of the Labour Party, is so that people do get the chance to earn, stand on their own 2 feet, not struggle from one week to the next, but actually have a decent life. So the framework that we're talking about is about making sure that, you know, it's the basic principle of natural justice. A decision about you, you've got to have an input into it. Because far too many workers now don't get to have that chance, don't get to have a discussion about what they get paid, because there's all sorts of devices used to, you know, make the worker and the end user of their labour kind of peripheral to the discussion. So we use contractors and labour hire agencies, and this arrangement that we've got, for example, with the Wellington bus drivers, the Wellington Regional Council and the bus company decide what's going to happen with the wage bill. It is actually outrageous that that should happen, and it is morally wrong. Workers should not find that a decision of 2 other parties is going to have an impact on their incomes when their responsibilities haven't changed, their skill level hasn't changed, their job hasn't changed. That is an outrage. And I feel the outrage amongst you now, I can feel it. And I'm expressing it on your behalf, because we have to. So we have a wage setting system at the moment that actually isn't working. And you cannot say, at a time when we have the level of economic growth that we have, but the sluggish wage growth that we have for the 2/3 of the working population, there is something not working. Can I just quote you from the Business New Zealand analysis? because there's another little point I made. The Business New Zealand analysis said, in relation to our wage growth stuff, dramatically increasing the minimum wage to 15% below the median wage will distort the wage structure of the entire economy. So my second memo to Business New Zealand is, we want to distort the entire wage structure of the New Zealand economy because it's not working, because we have to do better, because we can't have families at the volume they are living in poverty, and we should not have charity after charity after charity set up to feed kids because their families can't feed them. There is something wrong with wages in New Zealand, and we've got to fix it. And I know that people like Kim Campbell and Kirk will want to be part of the conversation about how we fix that.
Thank you, Andrew. We've got some more questions from the floor. One over here. I'm going to get fit today. Federated Farmers, I think.
Thank you, Rachel. I'm Lee Catley from Federated Farmers. All sorts of things we could have asked everybody about this morning, but I just want to hone in on one thing. We're struggling a great deal at Feds to deal with the policy approaches, virtually from all of you actually, on immigration. We have a distinct lack of enthusiasm in this country from younger people for working in the primary sector. It's been calculated we're going to need another 50,000 people working in the primary sector in New Zealand by 2025. Federated Farmers is trying to get its own dairy apprenticeship scheme up and running and is struggling really hard to actually get any go forward on that at the moment. The recognised seasonal employer scheme, fantastic Labour Party policy, which is helping horticulture. 10,000 people coming into the country every year and going home again after they've worked for us because there's nobody else here to do the work. Denise, we do advertise the jobs, big time. You have to. You have to. You have to. And then you still only get 2 Kiwis apply for a job that's paying 55 grand in the Waikato and 30 migrant workers desperate to come and do that job. So what are we going to do in the next, not just next year, the year after that, in the next 10 years? So I'd like to hear specific primary industry thoughts from you all, please.
Let's start with Denise, I think.
Yeah, I guess the answer to your question is that we're not opposed, and we are not opposed to workers coming here and skilled workers. And I note that the Filipino dairy workers in the South Island have had, I think they've had an exemption to their visas so that they can become permanent residents now, Michael. Yeah. But, I mean, one of the issues, I think, with the dairy sector is that is one of the areas that there is a high health and safety risk in those jobs. I understand what you're saying about $50,000 per annum, but in terms of wages that are being offered. But I also recall Helen Kelly tweeting that the hours of work for those wages were something like 13 to 14 hours a week, or 60 hours a week. 60 hours a week, 13 to 14 hours a day, and so. I really do think that we need to be looking at some of the working conditions particularly on dairy farms. There was a factory labour inspectorate investigation of a lot of dairy farms quite recently in the last year or two, with a very low rate of compliance in terms of minimum employment standards. So I think the dairy sector also needs to step up their game in terms of employment conditions. Maybe part of it is that your reputation's not that flash. But in terms of...
it's a bit harsh, the Feds.
It is harsh, you're quite right. It is harsh, but you've got people dying on these farms.
Yeah, it's an interesting situation you've got. My brother came through the Federated Farmers Cadet Scheme. He's now 48. He was 15, far too interested actually in girls and fast cars at school. 15 years old, he came out and got put onto a farm and worked his backside off, I have to say, as a young kid. Kept him on the straight and narrow. And now he runs 4,000 acres in the King Country. He's farming venison, big Manuka honey operation there, beef, lamb. You know, farming is a hard job, and it's not about, I think, necessarily, you know, clamping down on farmers and saying, you know, sure there needs to be some standards lifted in some areas, but it's a tough industry, but it's an industry that drives this economy as well.
Yeah, thanks, Rachel. I'll just try and take away the doom and gloom from that a little bit and just try and lift up the whole vibe. Look, the reality is, you know, when you hear comments being made coming out of Parliament about our Kiwis being hopeless, I think the word they meant is they feel helpless. We have got an issue in New Zealand right now where we are seeing a decline in, and we've seen systemic unemployment that's sometimes generations deep in families, where people feel like they just can't get out of their situation. They've seen their parents and their grandparents go through this, and we've become a state that is just absolutely incessant in giving handouts. So we've become so socially aware that we just give money out with no recourse for helping people up. We've stopped the wraparound service to say, look, you've got a problem, let's get you out of this hole. We should be giving stick if needed, but if you don't, take the carrot. So here's an opportunity to go and work. The state's not going to sit there and provide you with employment just for sitting around playing PlayStation or whatever it is they play with when they're at home with the lights down dark, whatever. The fact is, we need to incentivise these people to get out there and take these jobs up. Where we can't fulfil those roles, we need to obviously look overseas for those workers to come in there. And we would certainly look at our workforce with those people as the community wage. So those people will not be just receiving the dole. You will have a responsibility to put back into your community, whether it be riparian planting for farmers or helping out with fencing, or whether it be putting in some insulation into state houses. Every single able-bodied person in this country should be working, and we should be making sure that they do so. And so we certainly support your sector, and we understand the frustrations, and we will certainly be working alongside you to fix that problem up, which we understand is very real.
Michael Woodhouse, what are you doing to fix it? It is a very real issue.
I think what you've heard is another example of this kind of immigration alchemy that New Zealand First and Labour are trying to sell to you. We're going to cut net migration to 10,000, Labour will cut it by 30,000, but don't worry, your business is going to be okay. And I'm afraid that is a mathematical impossibility. So in terms of immigration policy, let me be very clear. Where you have a genuine labour shortage, the national government will make sure you get that shortage solved. But two things. You need to come along and federate the farming industry and the primary industries generally have been called out, I think, as the rapid change in the size of and the corporatisation of farms, together with the loss of families on farms, have meant that young people have not seen that as a viable career. And as Rachel's brother is a really good example of it, it sure can be. So there is a promotional aspect to doing that. But in the meantime, we will support you with your labour needs. The South Island Pathway to Residence was a recognition that there are a growing number of people who have been here for a very, very long time with no pathway to residence. And I don't think that's fair on them, and it's not fair on their employers. We need to be honest with them about their prospects for residence, because as you know, far, far more people who are here on temporary visas want to stay forever, and they can't all do that. So let's have an honest conversation with them. The Filipino farm workers are fine with that. I've spoken to a number of them because their alternatives as a very large overseas worker diaspora is generally the Middle East. Now, the worst conditions in New Zealand are still 4 times better than the best conditions in the Middle East. But I'll finish on this one point, and it's taking my immigration hat off and putting my employment relations hat on. There are some of our primary industries that are at reputational risk for the isolated cases that Denise is talking about. And it's actually not the RSE employers, by the way. It's the ones who aren't in the umbrella of the RSE scheme. But in a global trade market, non-tariff trade barriers will be put up, and they will be environmental and they'll be labour practice. And if we can't demonstrate that our wine, our kiwi fruit, our pip fruit, and our sheep and beef and dairy are produced using appropriate employment standards, we could lose those markets. And that's something that concerns me, not because it's widespread, but because those small cases could drive people's perceptions offshore, and we need to be absolutely scrupulous in our efforts to drive out that bad practice.
So two very quick things on that. Labor's Ready for Work policy was very much driven from a conversation that I had with a bunch of farmers and horticulturists last year who were saying, look, we try and employ young Kiwis who've been out of work for a long time, various habits develop, they don't make it, they don't last. Is it possible for the government to do something to make them ready for work? Funnily enough, we have a Ready for Work policy. So that's about taking those young people, those 70,000 16 to 24-year-olds who've been out of work for more than 6 months, putting them on giving them work, and it is a make-work scheme, giving them work so they get into the habit of having something to get up for in the morning, somewhere to go, something to do, getting their self-confidence back, learning some skills where we can, and getting ready for work to do just that sort of work. So I'm confident that that will make a big difference. The other point I just make this. A couple of years ago, my first term in Parliament, when I was Buddy MP in New Plymouth, I dealt with a constituent, a guy who was in his late 40s, an experienced farm manager. He'd been on plenty of farms, and his latest farm, he'd fallen afoul of the farmer and was in some big dispute with him. And he showed me the employment agreement he had. It was the Model Federated Farmers Individual Employment Agreement. Brilliant agreement. Absolutely compliant with the law, absolutely nothing wrong with it. Except that the farmer of this farm manager, when he employed him, decided he didn't like some things that were compliant with the law and just struck out whole clauses. And one of them was the holidays clause, because the farm owner didn't think that the farm manager needed to have holidays because there's plenty of time to rest and relax, managing the farm. There is an attitude problem, possibly by some of your members, about this stuff, and I think the reputational risk that Michael talks about is real. And I think the industry, federated farmers and others, got to work hard actually to lift the kind of farm performance of things like workplace relations. I know they can do it. They're good people. But they've got to get over this idea that actually having some basic rules and regulations and looking after people is a bad thing. It's not. It's a good thing.
I'm going to give the Feds the right to reply here.
Thank you. The benefits of having family connections with farming. Thank you, Rachel. Just to thank you all really for what you said. Denise, I think I might have to take you out on a couple of farm visits.
I'll work on one. All right, thank you. I think I've got one more question over here. There you go. Thank you. It's on, I think.
Phil Love from Business New Zealand. Student loans. Jacinda talked about maybe having some changes to student loans in the future if they get into government. That's got a lot of young people excited. There's not many young people in this audience today, unfortunately, with the greatest respect. But just from the panel, could you articulate where you sit on that, whether you would support Labor on that?
Yeah, look, I think the maths is something like between 75% and 80% of every dollar spent on an individual's education, tertiary education, is paid for by the taxpayer. And I think that's fair. There's a significant public good, but also a significant private good. I think we've got the balance right, bearing in mind that those dollars are coming from the checkout operators, the service station attendants, the construction workers, who aren't getting the immediate benefit of the education that student is getting. I think the numbers that Stephen Joyce came up with when he was Tertiary Education Minister was something like $1.5 or $1.6 million more in income over the life of that person's career if they had a tertiary degree rather than not. And I think we've got the balance right. So there are no plans to change where we're at right now from the National Party.
Yeah, it's a good question. Currently, the government is spending about $4.183 billion on tertiary education, and I think we're approaching about $17 billion on our books for students that haven't paid their debts and have headed off overseas, and some of that money is potentially collectible and some of it is not. We certainly believe that we should be doing a dollar-for-dollar payback with those people coming in if they come back into the country to work in regions and areas and use their expertise here. Moving forward from that, we believe that we should be having this upfront tertiary education policy, which is actually paying for your education, but making sure that the time that you've put into your education is put back into the state before you go and shoot off overseas to go and put your new wares, if you like, into other economies, and that will come at 4.86 billion, which is just over 500,000 more than what it's currently costing now, which will take it up to about 1.87% of GDP. We see that as a far better approach. Education needs to be treated as an investment for this country and not as a bottom line cost item.
I find it ironic that I think every person of us on this stage we're part of a generation where we were paid allowances and had fee-free tertiary education. The Green Party policy is that we want to cap the loans and then phase them out and have free tertiary education.
We're at about $15 billion, I think, of student debt at the moment. We don't have an immediate solution to the whole of the problem, but what we will do in some sectors, some professions, teaching is one of them, is where we want to encourage or incentivise teachers to take up roles or to take up additional training. We'll look at offsets or write-offs of their student loan. We have a general view that we want to do that in other sectors as well, particularly health. So we're trying to get health professionals to go to parts of the country that are finding it difficult to recruit. And we have to find an equivalent kind of approach for private sector work as well, to make sure that we're getting professionals and skilled people into areas that are finding it difficult to recruit people there, using write-offs on student loans. We don't have a developed policy on that, but you can expect to hear something from us in due course.
Thank you so much. Andrew Little, Denise Roach, Clayton Mitchell and Michael Woodhouse, Minister. Thank you all.